Hello, today we will explain the plot of the movie called Door in the Floor, which was released in 2004. Let's start with the story. The movie begins by showing a family in a simple house. Then a married couple named Ted Cole and Marion Cole are seen. Ted gives Marion a newspaper and shows her a picture of a young man. He wants to give a job for the summer because the young man also wants to become a writer. During the conversation, her husband Ted said that he wanted to separate for a while. During the summer, Marion seemed to be silent. She did not respond to anything her husband said. As he slept, Ruth, Ted's young daughter, came into his room and said she had dreamed that she had heard a voice. Ted awoke and took Ruth with him to look for the sound. Ted took Ruth in his arms, and they stood in front of a photograph of two little boys named Thomas and Timothy, who were Ted and Marion's deceased children. Ted told her that when Thomas was the same age as Ruth, and Timothy was still in diapers, Thomas had the same experience as Ruth. He heard a voice and woke up Ted. At the end of her father's story, Ruth asked where her mother was. Then Ted said that her mother was in another house, and that she would be in the house they were in. Tomorrow morning, the next day, Marion was seen in her car parked on the beach, staring out to sea. After a while, when she heard the sound of a ship approaching the harbor, she approached the ship. As the passengers disembarked, Marion looked for the young man her husband had shown her, a young man named Eddie O'Hare. Soon they met, and Marion invited Eddie to come home with her. When they arrived at the house, Eddie got his luggage out of the trunk and asked Marion if she was coming inside. Marion replied that not tonight, so she got into the driver's seat and drove away from the house. As he was about to enter the house, Eddie ran into Ted, who was working out in the backyard with an old man. Ted introduced Eddie as his new assistant to the old man, and then Ted invited Eddie to enter his residence. Ted explained to Eddie that he was temporarily separated from Marion. He also said that during the day, Eddie would work in the small apartment he had rented, after which Eddie would sleep at his house at night. Ted told Eddie to pack his things. As he went to his room, Eddie looked at the pictures in Ted's house. He saw a lot of pictures of two little boys, but he only saw one little girl. To make a long story short, Eddie was having dinner with Ruth when a young woman appeared, who turned out to be Ruth's nanny. After a while, Eddie went to a place to get squid ink on Ted's orders, and when he returned to Ted's house, the man told Eddie to put the squid ink he had taken into ice cube trays. Ted explained that he wanted to sketch a model, then asked Eddie why the young man didn't just go to the beach to swim. However, Eddie seemed to refuse and said that he could help clean Ted's workspace because he wanted to help. But Ted refused. Ted said that contemplating the waves would be much more beneficial for Eddie as a young writer, so Eddie finally agreed to Ted's order. Then Ted began his activity of painting a naked woman at night from his room. Eddie saw Ruth doing something in a picture frame. Ruth also noticed and looked towards Eddie's room. Surprised, Eddie closed the door to his room. The next morning, Eddie went to a house that Ted had told him about, where he would work during the day. It turned out that Marion lived at the house. When he arrived at the house, Marion greeted Eddie, and then the woman just left the house. Then, Eddie entered the house and prepared to start his work. But while in the house, Eddie smelled Marion's scent. He then entered Marion's room, picked up the pillow she was using, kissed it, and soon began his work as a writer's assistant. In the evening, Eddie came to a beach. It was seen that there were many people having fun on the beach. Then Eddie went to a movie theater and watched a movie. Unexpectedly, Marion was in the same theater studio as Eddie. It turned out that the young man followed, where Marion went after the movie was over. Eddie waited for Marion in front of the theater. Well, Marion looked as if she was wondering what Eddie was doing there. So she greeted Eddie, they chatted. Then Marion saw a box of popcorn that Eddie was holding. She asked if it was Eddie's dinner, to which the young man replied yes. Eddie said he thought Ruth didn't like to eat with him, after which Marion invited Eddie to have dinner with her another time, and Eddie accepted her offer. After that, Marion said goodbye and left Eddie. At night in his room, Eddie holds a photo of Marion. A moment later, he masturbates while looking at Marion's photo. In the middle of his activities, Ted suddenly knocks on his bedroom door and enters with Ruth. Eddie is, of course, surprised. He quickly puts the photo back in its place. Ted said that his daughter wanted to make sure that all the photos in his house remain safe and untouched. After seeing it, Ted and Ruth left Eddie's room. The next morning, Ted ordered Eddie to pick up the work he had left on the table. However, it seems that the young man did not do as Ted ordered, but instead followed Marion secretly to the beach. When he returned to the house where Marion was staying, Eddie, who was debating while looking at Marion's underwear, was caught red-handed by the woman. Marion was quite surprised to see what Eddie was doing. The young man quickly put his pants back on, and she was embarrassed. Marion said that she should have knocked earlier, and she felt guilty. Marion also said that she was not angry, but just embarrassed. Eddie, who was in shock because he was caught, could only remain silent. Marion then asked Eddie to come over and sit next to her, after which Marion said that she understood what a boy of Eddie's age felt. Marion was happy to know that there were still people who thought about her then. Eddie said that he was thinking about what Marion was wearing. When Marion heard what Eddie said, she stood up and picked up a package and handed it to Eddie as if she wanted to end their discussion. To make a long story short, one day Eddie accompanied Ted to a place. Ted said he would be there for an hour, then asked Eddie to work on revising his writing. After dropping Ted off, he went to Marion's house to work on the revision Ted had given him. A short time later, Marion came to Ted's house to invite Eddie over for dinner. During their meal, Marion opened the conversation, asking about the work Ted had given Eddie, and Eddie told her about it, hearing how Eddie talked. Marion said that Eddie was too serious, and a boy his age shouldn't be too serious. Eddie said he knew a joke, and Marion asked Eddie to tell her. After listening to Eddie's joke, which didn't sound funny at all, the atmosphere became awkward, but Marion still said she liked the joke. Marion told Ted about her problems. The woman looked very sad. After dinner, Marion showed some photos of her dead children. Then she told a little about them. There was an obvious feeling of sadness hidden by the woman the next day at Marion's house. The woman talked again about her two sons. Then Marion asked if Eddie had ever had sex, and the young man said no. Hearing this, Marion undressed in front of Eddie, who did the same, and they slept together. Sometime later, Ted saw Eddie and Marion walking around the house together. Long story short, Ted was seen at an event, explaining the contents of his bookwork, and of course Eddie was there to help. When he finished reading his book, there was applause from the audience. Then they went home, and in the car, Ted thanked Eddie and was grateful that Eddie could be a good friend to Marion. Eddie was a little confused. Then Ted said that if Marion was very unhappy, he was happy to see her smiling again. Later that night, Eddie and Marion are seen having fun. After finishing the activity, Eddie wants to get something from the fridge, but suddenly, the phone in the house rings and Eddie picks it up. On the way, Eddie meets Ted, who is riding his bike. Eddie offers Ted to get in the car, but Ted tells Eddie to go home. Eddie then left Ted the next day. Ted is seen painting a naked woman and then playing tennis with Eddie in a room. At night, Ruth, who was sleeping, woke up because she heard a noise. She came out of her room and went to the source of the noise. When she entered the room, she screamed because she saw Eddie and his mother having fun. Eddie, who had been caught red-handed with Marion, was shocked and went into the corner of the room. Marion told Ruth to calm down and go back to her room. The next day in the car, Ted said that Eddie might be asked to testify. When he and Marion separated and the custody issue arose, Ted asked Eddie not to lie in court. One night, Eddie and Marion were lying on the sofa, and Eddie asked Marion to tell him about herself because he wanted to know more about her. Marion said Eddie already knew a lot about her. After a while, Eddie asked about the accident that had happened to Marion's two sons, but Marion ignored Eddie. Eddie called out to her and she looked at him blankly. In the morning, Eddie woke up to the sound of Ruth screaming for her mother in a hurry. Eddie went over to her and saw Marion cleaning Ruth's injured hand. Later that night, Ted found it difficult to put his daughter to bed because the little girl kept calling for her mother. Shortly after, Marion arrived with Eddie and immediately took over Ruth and calmed her down. Ted also asked Eddie to take him back, after which Ted looked very frustrated at home. A moment later, Ted told Eddie to deliver Evelyn's self-portrait, the woman Ted had painted naked. When the woman saw that it was not Ted, she became angry, asked if Eddie had seen the paintings, and even slapped Eddie on the cheek. Eddie being treated like that got scared and finally decided to leave immediately. Eddie then drove Ted to Evelyn's house, but after Ted got out of the car, Eddie suddenly left the man. Back at Marion's house, Eddie is ordered to confess everything that happened to him because Marion wants to break up with Ted right away. Marion said that if Ted hit Eddie, the young man should hit back, and Ted would definitely stop. On the other hand, Ted is still being chased by a very angry Evelyn, and he even runs to the beach. Ted reaches a shop owned by a friend who often buys his paintings, and his friend is willing to take him home. Eddie and Ruth went to a print shop. Eddie was angry and asked the print shop to finish his order that day. The manager came to Eddie and gave him a piece of paper to write his complaints on, but Eddie instead wrote that he had slept with Marion 60 times. After getting the photo he wanted, he and Ruth left the store. On the other hand, Ted, who had just arrived at his house after being dropped off by his friend's wife, saw Marion getting ready to leave. Ted approached Marion, who was in her car, and without a word, Marion left the house. Shortly after Marion left, Eddie returned to Ted's house with Ruth, and Ted told Eddie that he had been waiting a long time and asked where Marion had gone. But Eddie gave Ted a piece of paper instead and asked Ted to read it. Finally, Ted learned the fact that Eddie had slept with Marion. Eddie enters the house with Ruth. He wants to give Ruth a bath, but suddenly, Ted follows him into the bathroom and takes over Ruth. To make a long story short, after picking up the phone, Ted suddenly slapped Eddie. He looked very upset, then he asked where his wife was. Eddie said he didn't know, so Eddie punched him in the face. Ted was angry with Eddie and asked why he had punched Ted in the nose. Then Eddie said it was an order from Marion. Ted immediately asked if the woman wanted to take custody of Ruth. Eddie replied that the woman did not want to take custody of Ruth at all, and she had told Eddie everything. Hearing this, Ted looked shocked and speechless. He then asked what kind of mother Marion was, if she wouldn't even try to take custody of her child. Irritated, Ted finally kicked Eddie out and told him to get out of his house by Sunday. A little later that evening at the beach, Ted offered Eddie a drink and then struck up a conversation. He said he still couldn't believe that Marion didn't want custody of her own daughter. He also said, what kind of mother would abandon her daughter? Eddie then replied to Ted. He said he didn't know Marion enough, so he couldn't judge her. Ted also warned Eddie that Marion could leave the young man at any time, just like now when she left Ted. Then Ted showed Eddie Marion's paintings that he had painted. In the middle of the night, Ted came to Eddie's room and woke Eddie from his sleep. Ted said that he would tell his two children the incident that had happened, where Marion would never be able to tell it to anyone. Ted also told all the sequences of the incident. There was a feeling of sadness on his face as he told the story, as if there was a look of regret on Ted's face. Until Ted finished his story, Eddie was completely silent. He didn't know how to react, and all he could do was shut up and listen before leaving Eddie's room. Ted said that he had hired Eddie because the young man resembled one of his late sons. Thomas. Ted also said that he gave Marion to Eddie, and after saying that, Ted left Eddie's room. The next day, the gardener from Evelyn's house came to Ted's house. Then Ted brought Ruth to accompany him to meet the officer named Eduardo. Apparently, Eduardo had been fired by Evelyn because he was considered to have saved Ted. He also asked to be hired by Ted in exchange for his favor. Ted agreed. He decided to give Eduardo a job. Then in the middle of their conversation, Ted asked about Eduardo's wife, whether his wife was working or not. He offered Eduardo's wife a job, cleaning his house and working as a nanny for his daughter. Eduardo agreed, and he would ask his wife. After that, Eduardo was given the task of driving Eddie to the port. While getting into the car, Ted said something before Eddie left. After saying what he wanted to say, Ted and Eddie shook hands for the last time, after which Eddie left Ted's house. Later, Ted was seen playing tennis alone in a room, looking tired and sad. He sat down, and a short time later, he opened the door on the floor and went inside.